Memory of war. Bennett was uneasy. With training over, it was hard not to be. Not with things becoming so vague. At the academy, he'd been told to shut his mouth, not to think. Everything was set up, one activity leading to the next. It was not the place to be somebody, to go against the system and have a personality. You just shut your trap, do what you're told, and go where you are told. You do that and everything will be just fine, Sergeant Thompson had said. And that was it. A year had passed by, at the command of a schedule. That was over. Bennett was being sent out, given a couple of forms and a 12-hour plane ride. He didn't know where he was, beyond the inside of an army truck. One that was rolling along a dirt road somewhere, anywhere. The names of locations were always need to know, and Bennett, the other recruits, they didn't need to know. But still, as far as he could figure, he was going into enemy territory. So, he was nervous. Training couldn't help that. Inside the cabin were his new squad mates. He looked at them, tried to read their faces. Were any of them nervous? He wondered. How could they not be? No one was talking. Nobody looked like they wanted to talk. Not even the few faces he recognized, the ones from the academy. It had been a strange place, friendly enough for the most part. At least, it had been for him. But his strangeness came more in the way that it existed for one purpose. To show the recruits how malformed they all were. A fact that the instructor found pleasure in reminding them of, at every possible opportunity. They were not men yet, just protozoa, fetuses, things still being formed, through fire and pain and fear, sharpened for use, to work for the system, tools to help get things done. You need to forget everything you think you know. Who you were is no longer important. You hear me? This here is 0.0, a new friggin' beginning, Sergeant Thompson said. Now you get to be something worth a spit. It had been a hard time, but it had been harder for some. Thinking about the academy, his mind wandering, he could not help but think about him, the one it seemed to affect most of all. Norman had looked younger than everyone else, too young to be in the service, and it didn't help that he was as skinny as a rail and looked about as flimsy as a newborn goat. A born target for the kind of people in the academy. Poor Norman. He'd had it worst of anybody. In a place like that, a pressure cooker, the other, meaner recruits were always looking to let off whatever steam they could. So they got to picking on the weakest, most solitary of them. Norman had been an easy target, and the insults even more so. "What are you doing here?" Kelly asked. "You must be crazy." Kelly was a big 23-year-old who had had a bad go at university and failed his way into the force. "Or maybe just stupid. Heck, you look plenty of both." He looked at the others around him, his audience. "You don't belong here, not a pussy like you." He'd say and hear the momentum come. The others wouldn't be able to contain their excitement. "Look at yourself, some kind of soldier. The first chance you get, you're gonna turn tail and run." Kelly edged real close to Norman. "That's if you're smart, because if the enemy gets you, they're gonna make you squeal real nice." Norman shrinked away, and Kelly would use it as a green light to start thinking of the kinds of tortures that could be inflicted, which would lead into every kind of insult he could think of. They were as creative as he could manage, and were all directed around the fact that Norman was small and weak and too stupid to know well enough to be anywhere else. The others would join in with laughter, with their own insults, a kind of momentum building up with it, an excitement. They were letting their frustrations out on Norman, giving voice to fears in themselves. It was clear enough for Bennett to see it in them. But Norman never seemed to understand that. When they would get mean and crowd around him, getting that look in their eyes, the hungry look, he would just stand there, drop his shoulders and look down, looking like just about the most scared kind of thing there had ever been. They would ask him such things, berate him, all to keep nudging him towards that hopeless look, the one that said he was about to break, and then they'd leave him alone. And he was alone most of the time. Bennett would see Norman in the corner of the mess, sitting there, minding himself. One day he joined him. It was not an act of any kindness. At least, he did not tell himself that's what it was. But his days of training had become filled with the event, the cycle, these assaults by Kelly, by the others. They would happen in the showers, the quarters, and the mess, wherever they were sure not to have the prying eyes of any instructors or officers. There was also always the spectre of the gangling figure in the corner, so he sat beside him and spoke. He greeted him and told him his name. Norman was hesitant to do likewise. "It's Norman, right?" Bennett asked, pretending not to know. Norman nodded his head, but he said nothing, so they sat a while in quiet discomfort, until he spoke in a whispered, quiet voice. "I'm not going to leave." Bennett had not heard his voice before. It suited him, so much so that he felt even more pity for him. "What?" "I'm not leaving the army, so you don't need to pretend to be worried about me." Okay. Bennett continued with his food, not knowing if he should be consulted or not, so he just ate and avoided eye contact. "I'm not here for them. They can tease me as much as they want. I wish they wouldn't, but if I can't get through this, then..." His already weak voice trailed off until it was nothing, almost as though he were discussing something with himself, as though Bennett's presence was irrelevant. Bennett had kept eating, not knowing what to say. He had regretted the decision to sit. "That means they're right." Norman nodded. "What if it gets worse? I don't know how it won't." Bennett asked. "I can take it." "Why?" "Because I'm not like they say," Norman said. "I'm here for a reason." There was a scary look in his eyes. It unnerved Bennett in a way that he never thought someone so much smaller than him could. "Family back home or something?" No family back home." He sucked in air, like a terrible memory, trying to suffocate it inside himself, take control of his insides. I used to have a mother, but she passed." Norman was looking down at the table. His eyes seemed ready to well up with the memory. It looked like he was trying to form words, trace a sentence, while his mind was racing. To Bennett's eye, he had a deranged, disconnected look about him. "There's nothing back home, so I'm going to do what I can here, doing what's right. I'm going to save people, save anyone who's being messed around with by bullies like that or anyone else. I'm going to make our country safe for whatever other country I can." He was smiling. Then he looked across the mess hall, taking a strange kind of look at Kelly, who sat pretty happy with a group of 5 other recruits, all of whom had caused him so much annoyance. "Because there is evil in the world." "Oh, okay," Bennett said, and the two finished eating in silence. Later, Bennett told Instructor Sergeant Thompson about what Norman had said. Thought he may have had to. Thompson nodded his head, but he did not get up from his seat or have the kind of crazed, worried look in his eyes that Bennett had thought he might. "Thank you for saying something, soldier," Sergeant Thompson said. "I'll keep an eye on things." Bennett was thanked and dismissed. He stayed away from Norman then, in the same way the other recruits did. But he still saw him, saw the verbal assaults that he had to endure, and the apparition of him in the corner alone. Still, Norman would have that empty look to him, and the others with looks of predators. Weapons training started. The group saw a lot more of Sergeant Thompson, who took charge of every session. A bad feeling went through Bennett when he saw Sergeant Thompson hand an M4 carbine to Norman. The two had looked over the weapon. The manner of the weapon's operation would demonstrate, and then each cadet was given a chance to use them on a range. Bennett paid close attention when Norman's turn came, not in the way the others had, not looking for chances to rouse him or throw a bob, but for curiosity's sake. maybe more than that. Thompson stood over Norman, who kneeled down at the shooter's mark. Bennett had thought that it would not be long before Norman was kicked out of the academy, and that was what he had thought would happen when he told Thompson. But that had yet to materialize. Norman took his first shot. It went into the distance. "Air ball," Kelly said, not long enough for Thompson to hear, but it brought a healthy chuckle, which would reach both Norman and the sergeant. Sergeant Thompson put a hand on Norman's shoulder and whispered something as he pointed a finger towards the far end of the range. There was a moment Norman seemed to be adjusting his sights, then he squeezed off his next 2 shots. Thompson looked into the distance and nodded his head. He took the M4 from Norman and told him to get his sheet. When he came back, Bennett could see how closely the bullets had hit. They were all grouped around the center. He had done better than any of the recruits. Physical exercise and conditioning drills were an important part of the training. Norman had started at the bottom of the class in all the categories. They were trained. When things were physical, he'd always looked on the verge of collapse. With any weaponry, he looked confused and scared, despite his shooting. Any tactical or team-based drills were troubles too. It was clear that he did not work well with others, or more, their inability to do anything other than insult him or ignore him was a detriment and seemed to be about the only thing he accomplished most times. There was one instance when Kelly, who had kind of forced his way into a leadership role, even suggested that it would be better if Norman died altogether. "How could you keep up with this? Is this a joke to you?" Kelly said. Kelly pushed him against the tree, pinning him against the hardwood of it. "No one is going to trust you to do your part. Save us from getting caught in your pathetic shit. And just get the heck out of here. The longer you stay, the more risk you're doing to everyone else who thinks it's okay to be a friggin' loser." As usual, Norman was quiet. He avoided eye contact until he and the rest of them got bored. The training had been agony, especially the physical component. When the body had started breaking down from the previous day's work or hadn't recovered from the day before that, it would not be given a chance to rest. Bennett had been sure that his body would fail him several times. There were several others who had failed, and they had disappeared from training altogether. The longer the training and the days became, the more Bennett thought that that would not be such a bad idea. It was as Thompson had said. They were being ground down, but somehow Norman was able to keep up. No, more than that. He had done very well. He had not failed where others had. In time, none of the others could voice objections. Norman had made the most progress out of all the recruits. His physical troubles seemed to vanish. And seeing him run some drills, it amazed Bennett with how Norman could use his tiny frame and what had become corded muscles to push and pull and run at an almost impossible level. Bennett noticed that the look that Thompson made when he looked at Norman, it was not this scrutinizing look of worry, but almost seemed to be one of a kind of satisfaction. At a time, Bennett would have been the first to do likewise. And he did, in a way, but he could not get over it. The feeling that came with that empty look. And he still heard those words in his voice. Evil is in the world, the idealism of a child. There had only been one more incident with Norman at the academy, and it had come at the tail end of another assault at the hands of Kelly. He could no longer berate him for his physical fitness. He was on par with anyone, and far ahead in the realm of effort. But still, the other recruits would be wary of him, and keep that distance. The lines between them had been drawn. Kelly was more than willing to dig them deeper, even if there was less enthusiasm than there had been before, less strength to the objections, to the claims that he did not belong. Despite how he handled his weapon or ran a mile, he was still strange, and they had taken their place. Kelly would do his darndest to keep things at their status. Norman was in his place, and all the others were above him. He would not let Norman break out of that. It had gotten to the point where, and still Norman had that empty look on his face. The ones that he affected when he was tearing through his runs, or his swimming, or push-ups. He had his circuit face on, and Kelly wanted it off of him. "You don't care about any of us." Norman did something that Bennett had never seen, something which none of them had seen. Norman smiled in his face. Kelly moved back, as though in fear, but he had gotten too close. Norman leaped at him, swinging his arms around, like a wild animal. Kelly tried to whack him with a stiff jab of his elbow, but Norman just took it. He latched onto his leg and Hep dropped his weight beside it. Two of them fell to the ground, where they continued to flail over one another. Kelly got a little distance and pressed an elbow into Norman's chest and pushing all his weight onto it, pinning him to the ground. But Norman did not stop. His limbs kept flailing and swinging, beating at whatever opening they could find. The academy had finished months previous, and now they were being sent into battle, or not. Bennett was still not sure. His training had revolved around Norman. It seemed as though everyone's had. He was comfortable with his rifle, with tactics and coordination, but was that all that mattered? He could not help but think that he had missed something, some vital piece of knowledge. He could not help with the feeling that he was not ready. The war was starting. Only there was no chance to retire to the personal quarters. It would be out in the field, maybe man against man. Whatever was ahead of them, they would have to face it, with all the menace they had been trained with. The specter of Thompson was still over him. If they messed up, or did anything less, it would get back to him. Or maybe it wouldn't. Maybe once training had finished up, he had stopped caring. Something worth a spit, he had said. And maybe he meant it. Failure was death, and this was hell. Or at least, the truck ride to it. He regretted the decision to join the force. He could have been anything. He did not have those fancy notions of fools like Norman, maybe like the others. He should have done something simpler. He looked again at his squad mates, at the one of them that he had recognized, and who had brought on all the memories of the academy. It was Norman. Norman was in the same squad as him, as was Kelly, who sat right across from him. Neither of them looked at the other. Norman had the same empty kind of expression that he had affected on his long runs, or bouts of brutality from the others. The stare that was parts pure concentration and absent-minded ignorance. Kelly, he looked almost scared. Perhaps because all of his fellow tormentors wouldn't be there. Or maybe it was just what it looked like. Bennett wanted to ask them if they had gotten over things. If they were ready to be squad mates. In training, he'd been told that mattered. He wanted to hear them talk, or anyone talk. Maybe say how crazy this all was, or maybe tell him that he wasn't ready. Anything would have been better than the sound of those wheels running along the dirt road, and the terrible silence besides. Bennett looked around the bus to see if there was anyone else that he recognized when he heard the sound. It was the violent, unmistakable sound of machine gun fire, and it sounded close. Willows, the squad commander, told everyone to ready their weapons. As if in response, several bullets were sprayed through the truck cabin from outside. It ran a scattered mess through the walls. Bennett heard some screams and Willows told him to get ready, to move out, and to remember their training. Bennett gripped his rifle in hand. He felt a wave of heat flush over him. The cabin of the truck seemed to become tiny, and he was sure that his body would fail. He pointed the rifle in the direction of the wall, at one of the holes that had been shot through. He wanted to see something through it. Something beyond the light from outside. Something he could have shot at to make him stop feeling like that. The truck was hit with an explosive and upturned. From inside it seemed like a kind of ride in a theme park. He was strangely aware of what was happening around him, watching it with an odd kind of detachment, as though he was safely strapped in his seat, while around him bodies tumbled and flew in the midst of a great churning engine. There were streaks of fire and fractured steel. Through the midst a hum of a great and terrible roar. This feeling of detachment came crumbling down along with the truck as it smashed and crumpled up on the side of the road. Bennett struggled to remember what had happened, but could only feel the pain of broken limbs, and the taste of blood and smoke. Around him there were bodies. Bennett didn't feel scared. He watched as the thin man got up from the wreckage, someone who looked familiar. He took hold of his gun. The two looked at one another, and then the thin man turned away, as the soldier made his way out of the truck, screaming wildly into the bright day. It was at the sound of gunfire and snarling that Bennett remembered the soldier's name, and that they had once trained together some time ago. There was more screaming and shooting for a time outside, before things got quiet. The end.